Okay, vessel A is basically the anatomy of vessels, and vessel B is physiology of how all that blood sloshes around in our body. So the term blood flow, that is the amount of blood that's going through our vessels, our organs, our circulation during a given period, and it's measured in mils per minute. So it's essentially the same as cardiac output for the heart, but it's for the entire vascular system. It stays constant when we're just resting, but of course, if you go and jog, blood flow is going to increase. You're going to have some vasodilation at those skeletal muscles because you're using them, so you need more blood flow to bring in more oxygen to keep those muscles cells healthy, just for example. But of course, when you're just resting, then, it's all good. It's all the same. Okay, when our blood is passing through the vessels, it came from the heart squeezes it out hard with a lot of pressure. And that blood is going to continue to put pressure on those vessels. Because it's pressure, it's measured in millimeters of mercury. We usually use those systemic arteries or muscular arteries that are closer to the actual heart. So, we put that sphygmomanometer around the brachial artery. Well, that's pretty darn close from the heart, right? You had your aorta, your subclavian, and then it's going to become your axillary and your brachial. Okay. Of course, this is what provides the driving force that keeps blood moving from higher to lower pressure is that pressure gradient. Okay, here's another term, resistance. So we have things, well, hopefully you don't have a lot of things that are bad, but we have things normally in our vessels that are creating opposition to flow. So resistance, sometimes you'll hear it called peripheral resistance, that's opposition to flow. And sometimes it's actual friction, like let's say maybe you have plaques, but there's three general things in our body that do create resistance, but a couple of them are relatively continuous, and one of them changes constantly. So blood viscosity, total blood vessel length, and then blood vessel diameter. So you can probably guess, let's think about this, blood viscosity. For the most part, do you think that your blood stays the same thickness? That's what blood viscosity is. How thick is your blood? Total blood vessel length. You think for the most part your blood vessel length stays about the same? And then blood vessel diameter. Does that diameter stay the same? Which one of these do you think is the one that changes the most? Well, I'll tell you, your blood viscosity can change somewhat, but for the most part, it's constant. If you bleed out, you're going to end up with less blood. If you're very dehydrated, it's going to get a lot thicker and sludgier. Your vessel length, that guy is going to stay the same length. So the longer the vessel is, the greater the resistance is encountered. If you think about this, you got a man, maybe 300-pound lineman for a football team. He has, first of all, he's a big man, so his vessels are going to be longer. And he's going to have more vascular branching into his muscles because he's got more to feed. He's got more cells to feed. This length creating resistance, that resistance is work on the heart. The bigger the people, the shorter their lifespan. So some of these linemen, they're dying in their 60s instead of their 80s. Okay, so vessel diameter. You probably guessed this already because the vessels go through vasodilation and vasoconstriction. They actually change the most all the time. What are you doing? It depends on what you're doing. So as you are, like I use the example, if you're exercising, you're going to have some vasodilation going on at the muscle level, making sure that those vessels get as much blood as possible. So you're going to have some constriction somewhere else, maybe your stomach. You can exercise those legs. If you're exercising, that's not really a good time to be digesting your food. We're going to give all of our oomph to those muscles. So, okay, resistance varies inversely with the vessel radius. So the larger the radius, the less the resistance. That's what that means. When something is inversely proportional, just like Boyle's law, you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. Well, for resistance, you increase the radius, you decrease the resistance. Same thing. And here's an example to help you remember that. Oh, no, not yet. I'll show you the example in a minute. Okay, so the major determinants of our peripheral resistance is going to be at the arterial level. Larger arteries, like, where your aorta is coming off, that guy doesn't change much. He stretches. I mentioned this in the last PowerPoint. He stretches so that he can accommodate that pressure that's coming from the heart. But he doesn't do a whole lot of vasoconstriction, vasodilation. He's a constant. He's a constant, and he's making sure that that blood trickles all the time. That's the great vessels, so the large elastic arteries. But the smaller diameter arterioles, the smaller they get, the more they have a factor on resistance. And then again, okay, so what else can change the diameter besides vasodilation and vasoconstriction? Well, those fatty plaques that you always hear about, the plaques that are building up in your vessels, that's called atherosclerosis. That's going to increase the resistance. And not only is it going to increase the resistance, it makes so we lost that nice smooth endothelium. It gets kind of rough, and maybe even we're going to have some swirling action, like turbulent flow. That's a regular flow. That's going to cause resistance. Okay, so here we go with the inverse proportional. The larger the diameter, the greater the diameter, the less the resistance. So here's a milkshake. You want to suck that milkshake out of the big straw or the little straw? Well, I guess it depends on how long you want that milkshake to last. But it's much less frustrating to use the big straw than little straw, because the big straw has less resistance. You don't have to work so hard. Get that milkshake up into that straw. Okie dokie, so why do I need to know all these definitions? Well, there is a relationship between all of those terms. So blood flow is going to be proportional to blood pressure. So that pounding pressure between two different points on a vessel, say the difference between the pressure of your femoral artery to your anterior tibial artery. There's a difference in pressure. When pressure goes up, flow is going to go up. You're going to exercise, maybe we're going to get an increase in pressure, we're going to get an increase in blood flow. Blood flow is inversely proportional to resistance. There's that word again. So when blood flow goes up, resistance goes down. When resistance goes up, flow goes down. So what does that mean? Okay, when a vessel dilates, blood is going to flow through it better. It's going to actually help that blood go at a nice, smooth rate. So, the heart squeezes the blood. There's always going to be some resistance, right? Because the things with what creates resistance, we had viscosity, length of vessels, and then vasodilation, vasoconstriction. You're always going to have a pressure, but that's good. Helps the blood move, right? Systemic pressure, so the pressure throughout your system, not pulmonic, right? That's different. That's complicated. Systemic pressure is highest in the aorta. The further it goes, it declines. When it gets about to arterial level, it really gets lower. So here we go. Starting at, this would be, so when we talk about blood pressure, we're talking about the pressure at the aorta. You know, we're measuring at, let's say, the brachial artery, but that's pretty darn close to the aorta. We're not down at our toe. So, you know, here we are, we're at aorta, and we're getting to artery area, and it's you know, dropped a little bit, but for the most part, it's about the same as it was right when it left the heart. Those arteries, though, are just going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then look at this difference. So we had a little bit of a drop right here, but we had a pretty significant drop going down to all those little arterioles, working our way to capillary. Pretty significant difference. Okay, systolic pressure is when your heart is contracting. You are measuring the pressure that has been exerted on the aorta at the highest peak. That is the strongest amount of pressure, and normal is 120. Diastolic pressure would be the lowest amount of pressure that your aorta is experiencing. So when your heart is at rest, you know, in diastole, that's going to be your diastolic pressure. So maybe you've heard somebody say, well, you know, that low number is important. It's that low number. So, you know, maybe instead of being 120 over 80, you're 130, but you're over 92. And your nurse goes, uh-oh. It's because of that 92. Okay. You know, the pulse is the ability to feel the actual pressure, the throbbing of your aorta. We have different places that you can actually feel pulse pressures. Just right under the skin. You never push really hard or anything. And so pulse pressure is essentially the difference between diastolic and systolic pressures. Okay. Mean arterial pressure. So when I tell you for the tests, you know, don't look at the average, look at the mean. It throws out the highest number and it throws out the lowest number and it takes the average. This one's actually a little bit different. You can't just take an average because the heart spends more time in diastole. Lub-dub, pause. Lub-dub, pause. I'm not going to ask you to do this math, but if you could just remember, for mean arterial pressure, you can't actually you can't just take averages. But mean arterial pressure is not a pulsing pressure. This is just flow as it's moving through the tissues at a lower level. All right, maybe you've heard the term TPR or vital signs. T would be temperature, P would be pulse, R is respiration. So blood pressure is in there too. It's not in the initials, but that is one of the vital signs that we take. Even at the dentist, they'll take your blood pressure. If you're scared of the dentist, your blood pressure is going to be up. Your brain has some control over all this too. Okay, taking a pulse. The radial pulse is the one I showed y'all in your lab book. That's actually one of the most common places. It's described in there. You don't want to push hard on that area. You're going to be going just proximal to the base of your thumb and just rest your two fingers, your index finger and the next finger lightly over that area. And you should be able to feel bump, 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 bump. Look at all these places. So the most common place is going to be the radial artery. I think I told y'all in dogs and cats, I use the femoral artery a lot. Just sticking your finger up in the groin, and it's a pretty easy to find pulse place. You can take it behind the knee. Let's say that somebody, emergency situation, there's all kinds of people intubating this person or maybe stabilizing the neck or whatever. Everybody's up at that person's head and then maybe somebody's putting an IV in and stuff. You can't get to the arms. Well, you can get a pulse pressure behind the knee, popliteal artery, and you can actually even feel a pretty good one on the top of the foot. Sometimes you can find one on the side, on the posterior tibial artery. The carotid artery, that's a great one, but again, if everybody's up around the head, then you pick someplace else. We did this in the heart lab. You did this with Dr. Boyd, anyway, that Thursday. So hopefully you get to pull out the sphygmomanometer. You remember one of the questions, she could just take a picture of a sphygmomanometer and say, what is this, for the lab test. So do your best to recognize how to spell that guy. You're wrapping that sphygmomanometer, the cuff, around the brachial artery, and you squeeze. You inflate that cuff till about 160, and what you're doing is you're pinching off the brachial artery so there is no flow. And then when you start to release pressure, you do it really slowly so that you can hear the first time the blood actually makes it through the brachial artery. That would be the highest pressure, right? And then when the sound goes away or it's significantly faded, that's the lowest sound, so that's the second number. The first number, the highest pressure, would be the systolic pressure, because that's when the ventricle is squeezing. And then the last sound that you hear, well, that would be the diastolic pressure. That's when the ventricle is relaxing. And I think I told y'all in the, if you could hear me, if you were able to hear me, the week of coronavirus, not going to school, but yes, we are, because we can't get behind. That's the karate cough sound. All right. Said that. Okay, venous pressure, it doesn't really change much, because remember, you're fighting gravity. So you're just trying to get blood from the lowest part of your body, or from wherever it is, but below the heart, or if it's at the head, then gravity's going to help you out a little bit. But it's gravity, it's not a pulse pressure that brings venous blood back to the heart. So if you cut a vein, it just kind of trickles out. But if you hit even an arteriole, it's going to spurt. Spurt, 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 spurt. So it doesn't mean you're going to bleed to death, but you do want to go ahead and get a little clamp on that guy, even if it's a tiny little arteriole, because they can make quite a mess. All right. Since we don't have good pressure, we have to have things that help fight gravity, to help get that blood back to the heart for the cycle. So we have pumps. You have the muscular pump. So for example, I told y'all, when you go for a walk, your gastrocnemius and your soleus and even your anterior tibialis is helping milk those vessels, getting that blood move up the leg. And then what keeps it from falling back down is valves. So you have these little valves. It's like, okay, made it that far. Squeeze it again. Go up. Made it that far. Squeeze it again. That kind of thing. Sympathetic venoconstriction to a degree, but not nearly as big as the pumps and the valves. Okay, so the respiratory pump. When you are taking breaths, you actually are squeezing abdominal veins in the abdomen. So that actually is also kind of a milking kind of action. It's just showing a picture of the veins. Here's a valve, so have a muscle, it's squeezed it up to here. Yay, I made it past this valve. And then we're going to have this muscle, it squeeze it up to here. And yay, made it past this valve, and that valve's going to close. If that valve fails, then you're going to get, you know, if it's a little vessel, it'll be a spider vein. If it's a big vessel, it'll be a varicose vein. And this is just showing the respiratory pump. When you take breaths, you're actually squeezing those deep veins also. Okay. Maintaining your blood pressure. So there's 3 factors. How much blood is your heart putting out per minute? So stroke volume times heart rate. The resistance and the blood volume. Well, they get regulated on different levels. I'll tell you right now, this guy, your kidneys, he's the major player on an everyday balance of homeostasis. We do have other things that are going to be short-term regulations. So what does that mean? So maybe you are, maybe you've been in a car accident and you're bleeding out. Okay, you have these little pressure receptors called baroreceptors in the aortic arch and the carotid sinuses that recognize, so they're actually inside those vessels, they recognize that your blood pressure is dropping. So it tells the brain, hey, something is wrong, I need help. So what's going to end up happening if you are losing blood, your vessels, your brain says, oh, I need all your vessels to constrict. I need you to get tighter. Sometimes we'll alter based on maybe hormones, but also epinephrine, norepinephrine. So coming from the adrenal gland, coming from the nervous system, whatever, it's going to decide where the blood distribution needs to be, depending on what you're doing. So if you are running away from a bear, where does all the blood need to go to? The blood needs to go to your skeletal muscles so that you can get away from the bear. Not a good time to digest pizza. The next one, you're just chilling, watching Netflix, you're eating a pizza. Okay, I think I would like some vasodilation and good blood flow going to my stomach to help me churn up this pizza and help me digest my pizza. Do your skeletal muscles need a whole lot of blood flow? No. So those guys are going to vasoconstrict some. And then, of course, if you're freezing your butt off, trying not to die, maybe you didn't pack properly because you decided to go to the Arctic Circle. We're just trying to stay alive. So we're going to have shunting of almost all the blood to the most important parts of our body. Our brain, our heart, our kidneys, our liver. It's going to shunt it away from your extremities extremely. That's how you get frostbite. But you know what? It could be worse. You could get more vasoconstriction up your arms, up your legs. You could lose arms and legs. We're actually going to have those little areas in your brain that you might remember, the medulla oblongata. Maybe you remember that from A&P1, or maybe you remember that from Adam Sandler. But anyway, we're going to have reflex control that's actually going on in our brainstem that's getting input from different places. So one of them is the one that I just mentioned. There's baroreceptors that's in the aortic arch and in the carotids. They're recognized as change in vasodilation, and then the medulla decides what to do with it. Remember, when I have things written really small, don't memorize any of that stuff. Understand the concept. Okay, sometimes you're going to have receptors that are actually recognizing chemicals. So pH, that would be hydrogen ions. CO2, again, just when you think CO2, think hydrogen ions. And then oxygen. So that might change the blood pressure temporarily. And then higher brain centers. Well, what is oh, here's more detail on those guys if you wanted to read about what I just said. So in the carotids and the aortic arch, we have little baroreceptors that tell the brain about the changes going on in the body. So it might stimulate the brain. It might stimulate the brain to vasodilate, or it might have it vasoconstrict. It depends on what's going on. The reason that these guys are short term is because if you have high blood pressure, let's do the high blood pressure because that's the most common one, right? High blood pressure, those baroreceptors are going to tell the brain, wow, I am under high blood pressure. And the brain temporarily is going to try and fix that. But after a while, these guys, these baroreceptors, reset. And they'll decide that that's just the new norm. That's just the way it is. So then it doesn't tell the brain anymore that there's a problem, because it's just decided, that's just him. That's just her. Okay, so chemoreceptors. You have chemoreceptors that are recognizing, are you too acidic? Are you high on carbon dioxide? You're not getting enough oxygen. So that's going to change blood pressure too, because we need to make sure that everybody is getting a normal pH. We need to make sure that everybody's getting enough oxygen. We need to make sure that everybody's getting rid of carbon dioxide. So again, it's going to go to the medulla oblongata, and we're going to have whatever response we need to fix that situation. If we are getting a low pH and a high carbon dioxide, we need to have increased pressures to increase the flow. Okay, so higher brain centers. What does that mean? Well, we have that fight or flight response that's in the hypothalamus. That's going to tell us, let's go ahead and get away from the bear. Or maybe the hypothalamus is also in charge of our body temperature. So when you have a fever, your blood pressure is actually going to go up. And then the limbic system, if you had me for AMP1, you know that you can be hijacked by your amygdala, because you can have, fear is normal, but phobia is abnormal. That's going to come from the limbic system. Other things too, it doesn't always have to be bad. So maybe my perfect example is walking into a room that smells like chocolate chip cookies that are freshly baked, and that just brings me instant happiness, and that genuinely does lower your blood pressure. This is part of your limbic system. That's bringing back a memory. I might not think at that particular moment chocolate chip cookies equals grandma equals love, which brings down blood pressure, but subconsciously chocolate chip cookies equals grandma equals love. Lowers blood pressure. This is just a picture showing exactly where those dudes are, but you don't need to memorize where these guys are if you can grasp the concept. So we have baroreceptors, chemoreceptors that are recognizing in the system changes in pressure, and they tell the brain, and the brain adjusts. But those guys, especially those baroreceptors, especially the baroreceptors, they're going to, if they are constantly bombarded by hypertension, they're constantly bombarded by high blood pressure, they'll reset and decide that that's just normal. So that's why they're short-term controls. Vasodilation, vasoconstriction, your body's changing all the time. So again, maybe that bear's not chasing you anymore, and now you're at home petting a cute little kitty. So your blood pressure is going to drop. Pictures to kind of help you out with that. This is just going through, okay, so I don't want to go through that. You can read. Okay, hormonal controls. So hormones are short-term also. We're going to have some changes in peripheral resistance. So some examples would be coming from the adrenal gland. Let's say you're scared, okay? We're going to increase cardiac output, and vasoconstriction. That's going to increase blood pressure because you've decreased the diameter, so you've increased the resistance. That's going to increase blood pressure. If you think about, let's think about this, a water hose. If a water hose is just turned on, water's flowing out nicely, and then somebody goes and steps on the water hose, so he's decreasing the diameter of the water hose because it's getting pinched. What's going to happen to the water? Is it still trickling out? No. It's going to start going psh, and start spraying in different directions. So when you have vasoconstriction, you're increasing blood pressure. Angiotensin 2. So this is going to go along with a whole cascade of events. But if you can think of tense, angiotensin makes things tense, makes things tight. Vasoconstriction, tighter vessels, so increasing the blood pressure. High levels of antidiuretic hormone is going to cause vasoconstriction, so it's going to cause an increase in blood pressure. Aldosterone. Aldosterone is increasing sodium, capturing sodium and keeping it in the vessels. So what's going to follow that? Water. You're increasing volume in that case, so you're increasing blood pressure. This one I touched on in the endocrine, but our atria has a hormone, atrial natriuretic peptide, and when that atria is getting pounded from blood pressure. So, if your atria is getting pounded, that means that the veins are even experiencing pressure. So, that's not good, first of all, if your atria is getting pounded. So it puts out a hormone called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, and that's going to decrease blood pressure because it's going to antagonize aldosterone. So instead of saving sodium, it's going to make you urinate out that sodium. If you urinate out sodium, water follows sodium. Just remember, water follows sodium. You urinate out water, your blood volume is going down. If your blood volume is going down, so is your pressure. But this guy, the kidney, he's the main dude. Long-term mechanism is your kidney. So there's two different ways. Direct renal mechanism, that's pretty much all the time. So on a day-to-day basis, we're talking about the direct renal mechanism. Indirect renal mechanism is in a crisis situation, like shock or you're bleeding to death. So, direct renal conditions, what's happening? Blood is flowing through your kidneys, and it's going to meet a little area called the glomerulus, and the glomerulus is your filter. And so what's going to happen is if you have an increase in blood pressure or volume passing through those filters, it's moving really fast, you're going to urinate out more. If things are moving fast, then the kidneys don't have as much time to recapture things. So usually on a regular basis, let's say we have normal blood pressure. Blood flows at a normal rate. The kidneys filter things through the glomerulus, and then it goes through those tubes that you've already met, that simple cuboidal, and the tubes are going to decide, I don't want that to go out in the urine. I'm going to recapture that and put it back in the blood. And then there might be some things that pass by in the blood further down the tube, and you're like, you know what? I really don't want that to be in my blood. I want to go ahead and get that back into my urine and urinate it out. So on a routine basis, this is what our kidneys are doing. When you have high blood pressure, it is pounding that glomerulus. It's forcing, that blood pressure is forcing more volume through that kidney, and because of the force, it's increasing the time frame, and it's rushing through the tubules. You're going to end up urinating out. If you have a decrease in blood pressure or blood volume, then the kidneys are going to recognize, wow, that's kind of a slow trickle. I better go ahead and conserve as much water as I can. And it can, because it's flowing slower. Okay, let's go through that indirect mechanism. Again, indirect mechanism is really going to have to be more about an emergency type situation. Okay, so emergency, your blood pressure is dropping. So those baroreceptors are going to recognize, Houston, we have a problem, is going to go and tell the brain. And the brain says, wow, I see that. What's going to end up happening is your kidneys are going to release another hormone called renin, because the brain is telling the kidneys, guess what? We have a problem. Okay, remember, whenever a hormone has gen, that is the birth of the hormone. That hormone is hanging out inactive until he has been activated. So who is going to activate angiotensinogen is renin. He's going to become angiotensin 1. We're going to get an angiotensin converting enzyme from the lungs, actually, converting it into angiotensin 2. He's the active guy. He's the guy that's going to do all the work. So remember, if we're going to get tense, we're going to get vasoconstriction. When we get vasoconstriction, so we decrease the diameter, that's going to end up increasing blood flow and increasing blood pressure, just like the water hose. And that's all those things that I just said. So how does angiotensin do all that? How does it help stabilize that blood pressure? Okay, well, one thing is it's going to stimulate aldosterone. The next thing it's going to do is cause antidiuretic hormone to be released from the brain. So remember, antidiuretic is going to make you hold on to your water. If you take a diuretic, you urinate more. If you take an antidiuretic, you're trying not to urinate more. Where's the water going? You're not urinating it out. It gets put back into the blood. Remember, all your blood gets filtered through the glomerulus, and we're going to have lots of stuff end up in the tubes. And then we're going to reclaim a lot of that stuff. This is a lot kidney. And the only reason, I usually skip this part, but the reason I'm going to go through this is with the whole coronavirus, our kidney section is going to get a little shorted. So repetition is key to learning in this case. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and that's why I'm talking about this. All right. So in a nutshell, you decrease your blood pressure. This would be an emergency type thing. Your blood pressure falling through the floor, your brain is going to say, problem, problem. So you're going to release renin from your kidneys. Renin is going to activate angiotensinogen. It's going to change it into angiotensin 1, change it into angiotensin 2, and it's going to cause a release in aldosterone and ADH. Both of those things will help get your blood pressure back up. So, what's the goal? We want a normal blood pressure to make sure each and every cell is getting the oxygen that it needs, right? We want a nice, steady flow. But we don't want it so high that it's actually pounding on the vessels. Because if it pounds on the vessels, especially those little capillaries, they'll just break. And, you got capillaries everywhere. You break all the capillaries in your kidneys, you go into kidney failure. You break all the capillaries in your eyes, you're going to go blind. So you get the idea. All the capillaries in your blood pressure too high in your brain, you're going to have a stroke. This is bad stuff. All right. Regulating that blood pressure. I'm going to talk about some diseases. Hypertension is, the definition of hypertension is when you stay on a routine basis. So like if you're suspect, maybe you went to the doctor and they were like, wow, your blood pressure is high and it was high last time. they're going to ask you to take your pressures on a routine basis and write it down. Write down a chart. And if you are staying high, so prolonged hypertension, they're going to put you on medicine because that high blood pressure makes your work harder. So remember, if your blood pressure is high, that's resistance. You are increasing your afterload, which makes it harder for the heart to squeeze. It's got to resist all that pressure that's in the vessels. And what happens to your heart when it's working harder? When it's squeezing, the harder it works. The muscle in the heart gets a little bit plumper with actin and myosin. It doesn't want to do that. It wants normal. He doesn't want to be Popeye. When he gets to be Popeye, the amount of room in the ventricle decreases. It becomes quite the snowball effect. Anyway, eventually that's not how that muscle works. It's going to get tired. It works so hard it just wears itself out. So primary hypertension, this is the most common one, so there's not another cause. It just is what it is. You get diagnosed with high blood pressure, and they actually can't find a cause. Most of the time, it's primary hypertension. So there's a heredity factor for sure. Diet, when you do those inside mastering, there's those interactive physiology. Can't remember what the guy's name is, but if you went to the heart section, it goes through how can you help him with his blood pressure. It's a pretty cool little exercise. I hope y'all are all going through that mastering because that's just going to help you learn. But anyway, whatever that guy's name is, he might be a little pudgy and he probably doesn't have a very good diet. Heredity is huge in this case. Other things, are you stressed all the time? Are you smoking? If you are, you need to quit. We all know that smoking is bad, even the vaping. And then diabetes. Diabetes can do so many different things. And then age. You can't cure high blood pressure, but you can control it with medicine, with diet, and with exercise. And then, of course, stop smoking. Less common is secondary hypertension. So it's secondary to some other disease. So kidney disease causes hypertension. All that your kidneys are in charge of regulating your blood pressure normal. If your kidneys are tired, you're going to get hypertension because of that. Sometimes it's even hard to tell what came first. Did the blood pressure wear out the kidneys, or did the kidneys cause the blood pressure? Anyway, other underlying disease, that would be secondary hypertension. See if you can control those underlying diseases, then maybe we can control that hypertension. Hypotension is rare, but maybe you've been one of those people that you were sitting down and you stood up really fast. You had a temporary drop in your blood pressure. And your brain said, whoa, did I get enough blood supply there for a second? But that's called orthostatic. It'll resolve really quick. Those people that say that they faint all the time, they need to check their diet. Now, could it be another disease? Yes. So could it be like diabetes or something like that that's undiagnosed? Yes. But anyway, I have it small. It won't be a test question. But this one, orthostatic, it's a very temporary drop in blood pressure. I think we've all kind of felt that. You stood up real fast and you got the dizziness. Okay, acute hypotension. This is when suddenly, for some reason, your blood pressure is falling through the floor. This is when that indirect renal mechanism is going to kick in. It's usually going to be some sort of shock, and you could just suddenly get pale and faint. If it lasts too long, you'll actually go into kidney failure. So if somebody's been in shock and didn't maybe ambulance couldn't get there quick enough for one reason or another, or nobody could call the ambulance, or maybe nobody even knew that that person fainted. Well, then the longer your kidneys aren't getting good blood flow, your blood pressure is so low, your kidneys aren't getting good blood flow, then those cells start to die. So, going to kidney failure. Okay, we've got 3 kinds of circulatory shock that we're going to talk about. So what's happening is the blood that's supposed to be passing through that hose, the water through the hose, whatever, it's going to trickle. So, you know, when water is going through a hose nicely, that hose is all plumped up. But when water is just trickling through, you can feel the pressure difference in that hose. So that's essentially what's happening, is that the vessel is not getting good blood flow. If it's not getting good blood flow, then the cells aren't getting good oxygen. So if the cells aren't getting good oxygen, it becomes that spiral, that downward spiral. So hypovolemic means low volume shock. That would be car accident or whatever that made you bleed out, and that's actually the most common kind. Vascular shock would be something like when you say somebody is allergic to peanuts, severely allergic to peanuts. What's going to happen is that person got a hold of a peanut and all their vessels got hugely dilated. So remember, when you dilate, the resistance is going to decrease through the floor, and your pressures just drop. You still have the normal amount of blood, but the blood's going to slow down because the vessels are excessively dilated. Cardiogenic shock is when you have a pump failure. So this, like, something is going on with the heart, like a heart attack, and so you're actually dying just because the blood's just not flowing well because the pump's not working good. All right.